Okay, well, welcome everyone. Got a nice crowd here. And welcome to this bar's digital event. It's a roundtable, so we've got a lineup of speakers who've generously decided to come in and talk to us today. And it's a roundtable that's about romantic creativity. So it's kind of about these two things, two concepts that you may or may not be familiar with. That the sort of the way that they work together, and maybe some of the ways that they don't work together. And this is the first of a two-part digital event that's being put on by bars this December. And this part will feature academic talks about romanticism, poetry, creativity, or some other things. We might hear other things. I mean, it's not totally known what we'll hear, and we'll hear a range of talks about different ideas related to our theme. Creativity is an incredibly broad topic, as you know, and it's something that factors into our lives in a daily capacity, as well as shaping our engagement with art and culture and our efforts to write, think, and learn more deeply about the worlds we find ourselves in. Um, this is the first of two events that are related. Next week on Monday, on the 15th, there will be another romantic creativity event. This one's going to be a workshop. So my name is Adam Nykirk, and I'll be leading that workshop next week. So if you enjoyed this discussion, this roundtable, and you want to continue to think about poetry, think about creativity and writing and things like that, please also come along to the workshop. And what we'll be doing is I'll be taking notes during this. I'm excited to hear all these speakers and write about what they've said, because then we'll be developing writing prompts based on their comments and ideas and inspirations, and we'll be using those to sort of run the workshop in that direction. That's sort of something I'm interested in doing. So also please come along to that one. And with that being said, I will introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Adam Walker, and Adam Walker is an independent scholar and public humanities educator who specializes in English Romantic poetry. He holds a PhD from Harvard University, where he wrote a dissertation on William Wordsworth and the poetics of natural piety. And his talk today will focus on spiritual poetics, formalism, creativity, and poetic craft. So please help me welcome Adam, and I'm going to mute myself so he can take it away.
All right, thanks, Adam. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to you and all the other coordinators for organizing this great event. So the question I'd like to discuss briefly is, where does romantic poetry come from? And the answers that critics have provided are varied, obviously, and each theory in its own way coordinates analysis and appreciation, and invites a particular form of appreciation. Walter Jackson Bates' theory that romantic creativity is a response to the shared inheritance of past literature comes to mind, as does Harold Bloom's more provocative account of romantic creativity as an agonistic contest with literary fathers in a Freudian drama. But other critics, such as Jerome McGann, John Barrell, Marjorie Levinson, revealed how romantic poetry, romantic creativity more broadly, constitutes an engagement with social and political forces. There's, too, the recent work of Anne Meller and John Mee, who position romantic creativity as coming out of this shared colloquy, a largely collaborative endeavor that has its source in circles of friends and relationships between poets. And also equally important are the eco-critical theories, which see romantic creativity as co-production with the natural world. So these are some of the few prevailing theories of romantic creativity, each of which contributes something important. But briefly here, I want to consider how romantic creativity arises from attempts to formally incarnate and communicate complex, often spiritual experiences into poems that formally encode that experience itself. I think one of the formalists who established kind of the way for this theory is Helen Vendler, who reads poems as enactments of mobile consciousness, kind of activity itself, and the result of ordering experience into something understood by the poem. I think much of the celebrated poetry of Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, is deeply associated with states of consciousness that involve an ecstasis and an experience with transcendence. States of consciousness categorized under spiritual. So it's really in that sense that I'm using the word spiritual poetics here as kind of a lens to understand romantic creativity. I'm going to take Wordsworth as a case study. His sense of the spiritual is not an essentialized institutional religion. It doesn't really derive from that. It's not really a retreat from religion into art. This religious power, as he sometimes describes it in his letters and essays, is better understood rather as a source of both poetry and religion, and he makes this distinction between those two sources. The tension between the spiritual impulse and the more religious, institutionally associated form of religious impulse is outlined in his 1815 essay supplementary to the preface. So he identifies, on one hand, the spirit of religion, which poetry administers and breathes, and religion institutionally conceived, on the other. So religion, he says, makes up the deficiencies of reason by faith. Its element is infinitude, in whose ultimate trust is the supreme of things. But poetry, aligned with the spirit of religion, has a more divine origin, he says, and is passionate for the instruction of reason, ethereal and transcendent, yet incapable to sustain her existence without sensuous incarnation. So with Wordsworth, there is a distinction between the spirit of religion and the divine origin of poetry. I think just helpful to keep those two in mind. Um, it's clear for Wordsworth, at least, and this varies with the other Romantic poets. But for Wordsworth, the diviner origin of creativity begins with an experience with what he calls the ethereal and the transcendent. And poetry is actively engaged in that sensuous incarnation. It's that process he describes in lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, first felt in the blood and then passing into mind, where it then becomes poetry and is understood. But our romantic poets' spiritual sensibilities are often formally encoded into the poetry itself. And I'd like to do a brief close reading here of a well-known short poem of Wordsworth's. These experiences usually move for Wordsworth from a state of turbulence to a state of tranquility. And we all recognize this throughout much of his shorter poems, though it also appears as an organizing principle in the prelude. This is the characteristic movement, and you can see it in the very short poem, My Heart Leaps Up. It reads, My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So is it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. So with its simple diction, the poem describes very simple experience of joy occasioned by the sight of a rainbow. You see the first line actually performing some of that excitement with that possible spondee with leaps up, and actually bringing the reader to the precipice of that enjammed first line with the word behold, and the object of the beholding suspended by the enjambment is revealed in the second line, of course, the rainbow in the sky. Then you have this attempt for stability here with the following lines with the anaphora, so was it, so is it, so be it. Establish a sense of stability by the speaker's wish to enshrine this elation, this excitement. And then you get this beautifully metrically contracted ultimatum that follows, or let me die. Another possible spondees, a pair of spondees, perhaps. Which really reinforces this impassioned wish for preserving with intense attestation and even anxiety. And it's these first six lines that make up that very excited moment. And you can see this division operating in much of his poetry. In the Intimations Ode, you see it in the first four stanzas, then you get this chaste philosophical distance with the fifth. And that's what we get in the seventh line. The child is father of the man. The possible metrical irregularity of the line and its repetition of the word man make it a slightly awkward, but the surprising aphorism allows the speaker to achieve this chaste distance from all the prior elation and anxiety. And then it stabilizes, reposing on the steady iambic meter of the concluding couplet. With the final pentameter line, the poem achieves a sense of tranquility in the concluding phrase, natural piety, the spiritual sensibility that he wishes would bind his days each to each. So this moment from turbulence to tranquility is the hallmark of many other poems, and including those in the lyrical ballads and many of his sonnets. You think of the Wenander boys' excitement on speaking to the owls, communicating with the owls. It's there in Ruth, it's in Lucy Gray, it's in the Lucy poems. They all undergo this movement. So that's Wordsworth, but you can map this onto the other poets as well to see what their particular sensibilities are. Percy Bysshe Shelley's, by the way, is almost the corresponding opposite of Wordsworth's. His experience with the transcendent burst outward into violent resistance to resolution. Ode to the West Wind, Mont Blanc, A Sabbath Walk, several of his fragments, such as Sweet Star, all follow this opposite pattern by beginning in stability and ending in a provocative question, metrical turbulence, or kind of apostrophic frenzy. The movement of Keats's poetry often involves a certain turning, which enacts at first a centrifugal movement, and then a centripetal force through the oscillations of concentrated attention as it kind of orbits the subject. Romantic poetry is concerned, I think, with formally encoding the experience into the poem and preserving its transmission through the reading experience. This is what's really interesting about these poetics. The poetic creativity embeds that movement of consciousness directly into syntax, the rhythm, and the form. I think seeing romantic creativity as a formal labor of this incarnation, as Wordsworth would describe it, the task of giving sensuous, temporal, linguistic body to experiences that exceed the limit of ordinary consciousness, I think comes nearer to the Romantic poet's own conceptions about creativity. So the source of the poem, under this perspective, is actually pressure exerted upon the imagination by experiences with the sublime or the transcendent. And I think their poems often become the places of encounter that preserve within the formal movement the very motion of consciousness that first provoked it. So that reading itself then becomes a new, renewed participation in that experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that great talk. I'm just going to post this couplet into the chat real quick, and I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Stacy Joy Russo, a final year PhD researcher at Northumbria University, whose project sits at the intersection of information design, creative practice, and romantic studies. As a designer and artist working in partnership with the Wordsworth Trust, Stacy explores how artistic methods can surface complex temporalities in literary archives. Her current research focuses on developing anarchival and participatory approaches for engaging publics with Wordsworth's Prelude, and she will talk about her recent residency at the Wordsworth Trust. I'm going to hand it over to Stacy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam, for the intro, and excuses in advance for my really atrocious South African accent. But as Adam said, my name is Stacy Joy Russo, and I'm a PhD researcher and creative practitioner in the final year of a PhD project being done in partnership with the Wordsworth Trust, or Wordsworth Grasmere, as some of you might know them. I've been really fortunate to be embedded on site in Grasmere with the team for kind of really the last 2 years, but particularly for the last year, And I'm going to talk a little bit more about a creative residency that I have just completed with the Trust in their special exhibitions gallery. I don't know how many people have actually been to the Wordsworth Trust in Grasmere, but it's just undergone kind of like a major reimagining where they've just kind of rebuilt buildings and reimagined the museum, and they're about to go into their next kind of 5-year plan. So it's been a really exciting time to be working with their team. So I've just dropped a short PDF presentation into the chat because I thought it might be easier for folks to kind of flip through some images as I'm talking. And I'm just going to give you a very rough outline of the work that I've just done and some of the kind of creative methods that I'm developing still for my thesis, which is ongoing. I'm due to submit next year, so there are kind of a couple of ideas that I'm refining. But I am joining you from a slightly unusual angle today, and that my background is in design and creative practice rather than literary studies. So whenever I collaborate with Wordsworth scholars or Romantic scholars and curators, I feel like I'm entering as someone learning from the field while also trying to, I think, build something that can belong to it or add conversation to it. So I come to this conversation mainly from the field of information design, when my work began with a very simple but I think quite persistent question. And that is, how can we explore and represent data in creative ways that honor the complexity of the world that produced that data? So for me, for my project more specifically, it's been about how we can explore the complexity of a poem and the temporal data and complexity of the poem, and in the literary archive to which it belongs. So my background involves developing visual methods for making sense of this complex material. And over the past couple of years, I've tried to bring that training into dialogue, in particularly with Wordsworth's The Prelude and the team at Wordsworth Grasmere. And so just to give you a little bit of background, my field of data visualization is actually still fairly young and often leads more towards technocentric approaches to practice. For example, many design projects that deal with data will focus on building new tools and new extractive techniques and software for surfacing patterns that can then be clearly communicated to an audience. So these methods, I feel like, are really valuable, yet really engage fully with the material qualities that can shape a poem's temporal life. So they target really the explicit information of a poem or a data set or a text, and they depend on things that are measurable and classifiable, and are really designed to support clarity and legibility above all else. But as an artist, I've always been more interested in the implicit information that lives around and inside the text and the qualities that resist this immediate capture, but nevertheless, I feel can continue to shape its meaning for the reader. So I mean things like the emotive field of the text, the relationship between the reader and the text, the contradictory feelings that appear during an encounter, or the ambiguous moments that refuse categorical placement, really. And these forms of information, they don't really behave like conventional data, but often unfold relationally, as I say, and take shape through the way that the text is reread and often in different contexts. So quite early in my doctoral work, I realized that if I wanted to take temporal experience seriously, I needed a different kind of framework than the one that existed in my field already. Where extracting data from the poem, I feel like would never be the same as actually encountering the poem as a dynamic temporal event. And this led me to a theorist and filmmaker called Nora Bateson, who comes from quite a long line of academic research. Her father was one of the fathers of systems thinking called Gregory Bateson. And her ideas helped me to develop an approach to temporal information that foregrounds relationship and emergence rather than reduction. And this approach is called warm data. And around the same time, I also began to explore creative methods for surfacing this warm data. And this is called the anarchive. So these two frameworks of warm data and the anarchive have really changed the course of my research with Wordsworth Grasmere, and that they were encouraging me to try and build a methodology, I think, rather than treating the prelude as a fixed source of information, and to try and work with the poem and with visitors to Wordsworth Grasmere as kind of like a living ecology that could be activated through creative practice. So warm data helps to inhabit and think about the poem as something relational, and then the anarchive being a practice that focuses on something being a live event rather than like an archival data set that stays static. And together, these two frameworks, they helped me to shape a project with Wordsworth Grasmere called the Time Lab. And what this was is that it was a creative residency designed with the team that was designed to function as like a hybrid studio. So I took residency in their special exhibitions gallery for 4.5 months of this year, and I've just finished it now in October. And the idea is that the gallery would open as a blank space and slowly evolve over the 4.5 months, where as an exhibition space and a public research environment, I would be creating drawings live in the space. I brought in musical instruments to compose music live. I sat down and interviewed visitors that came into the space over the summer, of which there were, I mean, thousands and thousands of people that came in. I think, in any one day in the middle of a high season in Grasmere, you can get between 250 and 300 visitors. So it was a really busy time. And the idea about warm data in the archive is that as the practitioner, my presence is there to kind of activate the space and be there to guide visitors. And during the summer months, what I did was I also hosted a number of creative workshops, which I'm going to talk about shortly as well. So when I started this project, really, I immediately felt that the gap between, I think, poetic temporality of the prelude and the design tools that I've been trained to use is quite wide. So you might think about representation of time as timelines and heat maps or graphs, not really able to fully capture the dynamic quality or effect or the lingering presence of memory. I think these kinds of tools, they work really well for quantifiable phenomena, as I've said, but they encounter difficulty when the poem moves through the body of the reader and the emotional field of the reader. So warm data offered me a way to think past those limits. And just in the PDF, you'll see that I've just added a couple of lines where Nora Bateson, she describes warm data as the relational and trans-contextual information that arises through interactions within a complex system. So in my research, this means recognizing that temporal experience does not exist in the poem alone, but arises from the interplay between reader and text and landscape and memory and sound and sensation, and emerges through context, most importantly, and cannot be separated from the bodies or the environments that help to generate that data. And then the Archive extends this orientation by asking to treat practice as an ongoing process rather than a finished outcome. So in contrast to an archive that stabilizes the past, you can think of the Archive as a way to keep traces in motion so that new events can keep forming and new pockets of research can keep forming and growing and emerging. So this idea shaped the structure of the Time Lab, where I looked to build a space that invites continual reactivation of the poem. And practically, this looked like inviting visitors to sit down and respond to prompts from the poem, such as writing down their own spots of time, reading through spots of time from the poem, responding to drawing prompts. What does time look like and feel like to them? While all of this is happening, I'm continuing to produce some drawings, and I made murals and wall murals of spots of time on the walls. That actually, it was really interesting to talk to visitors about what that experience, I think, did for them, as I think there were quite a few folk who came in who had never encountered the prelude before, they'd never encountered Wordsworth before, and really was just designed as a way to speak to visitors who had many different kind of experience levels. Folks come in, they're looking maybe just to visit a museum for a day, or they might be walkers, and in every which way, I think visitors are looking to find something of themselves in the landscape that they come to. So it was really an experiment in trying to meet people where they're at and to help them to activate the space by leaving some of their own stories behind. And so over the summer, I also conducted a series of 4 workshops, which I'm using now to refine kind of like a creative methodology for my thesis, which I'm calling time resonance mapping. And this offers a structured way to investigate how visitors or how people experience time when engaging with the prelude as a case study. So the sequence involves 3 stages, which I've just written very briefly in that PDF. And the first stage is called temporal drift work. And this was a workshop where I just guided participants on a walk outside Dove Cottage, which is on site in Grasmere. And I would lead them through a series of like performance scores where we take sections of the poem and we get them to perform them outdoors. And they followed various embodied themes such as listening and drawing and working, through their own memories and spots of time. And then they would come back into the room, and then we would do guided poetry writing exercises with them. So they would then leave the workshop with some creative compositions of their own. And then that would lead to the next workshop called temporal drift mapping, where participants would then take those found poems that they had written and they would translate them into drawings or marks on paper to create some kind of visual mapping of their kind of emotional encounter with the poem. And then the next workshop would be called Time World, which is where participants would then take their poems and their drawings and then would produce some kind of responsive piece of creative writing. And the idea being that, they would just continue to build on one workshop from the other. And then finally, I performed a fourth workshop called the Archive, which is where we created a series of zines. So finding a way to actually publicize or communicate these bits of writing and drawing in a way that they can share with friends and family, and also feed back into the archive at Wordsworth Grasmere. So this was the summary of my wonderful time that I've just spent with the team. And I think that the final aspect I wanted to emphasize about this project is the role of maintenance and care. So as I've mentioned, the time lab required, I think, and the ongoing presence of someone in the room, which was me for the first 4.5 months. But the idea being that there would be somebody there to activate the space continually, talk with visitors, and that was a way to embody the kind of the spirit of the archive. And the idea being the accumulation of drawings and conversations and artifacts would require continual tending, and there would be an evolution of the space where the walls would change, visitors would respond to one another and begin to talk to one another across time, where we had people leaving postcards at the beginning of the residency that would then be built on and responded to at the end. And it's just a system that I try to think about as keeping alive in a way to activate the poem in real time. And what I'm hoping to write about in my thesis is the way that, or to suggest that designers and artists and curators and scholars can work together to cultivate these kinds of active encounters and surface this information about time and temporality that is essentially warm and active, and recognizing time as like a compositional material. And by supporting conditions that allow warm data and relational data to form, we can think about new methods for engaging literary heritage, I think, that feels grounded, and help us to preserve some of our treasures for the future. And we presented this project at the Museum Next Creative Summit. I don't know how widespread that conference is, or who might know about that conference, but we produced a 20-minute film, and I'd be interested to share the link if anyone would be keen to see that presentation. But that just involved some interviews from the staff at Wordsworth Grasmere and myself, and just explains the project in more detail. And there's some visuals there of how the space evolved as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacy, for a very fascinating presentation. I'm going to be moving right along after each presentation so we can attempt to keep the time. But I always have a lot of thoughts and notes on everyone's talks. So we're going to move right along to Dr. Adrian May, who's our next speaker. And Adrian May is an author and a songwriter and the former Deputy Director of Creative Writing at the University of Essex. He's the author of 4 creative writing textbooks, the most recent being Myths and Heroes in Creative Writing, which was published by Routledge in 2025. And his talk will be about inspiration. So let's welcome Adrian May. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Inspiration is something that people mostly avoid talking about, in my experience. They don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to define it. And it seems to me that it's about surrounded by cliches and paradoxes and a certain amount of the feeling that it's taboo. But it's worth remembering that taboo just means sacred, in fact. It doesn't actually mean forbidden. It just means something that's special and perhaps a bit difficult to look at. To define inspiration, Eric Partridge, in his etymological dictionary Origins, talks about it as meaning breathing in or breathing into. And I think both of those things are worth bearing in mind, because they hold the self and the other and the outside as well as the inside, which I think is very important communication and very important element of inspiration. Inspiration being like a kind of kiss between the outside and the inside, if you like. And you can't really avoid the divine connection of inspiration, the breath, and obviously embodied by a wind, and the kind of breath of life, that image. Dudley Young, in his book Origins of the Sacred, refers to this power as being pneuma, which is spelled Pneuma, which is a source of divine energy, and which has movement and the ability for change in it. He talks about wind as being our oldest divinity. So the answer is oldest divinity, rather. So the answer is literally blowing in the wind. Secondly, I want to talk about invocation, as in invocation of muses, which just means a calling forth, like a prayer is a kind of invocation. And the sort of paradox of humility and pride that involves, really. And this is a very sort of fateful thing. The Milton is a really good, the beginning of Paradise Lost is probably the last great invocation, although that's arguable. He covers all bases. He has Urania, Moses, God, and also he kind of calls on himself. He talks about wanting all these muses to aid his adventurous song. So there's a kind of the personal comes in. It's not breathing through him, it's him too. There are more modern examples. There are Hart Crane at the end of the bridge invokes the bridge itself as a kind of iron or ironic muse. Traditional folk song also often have invocations at the beginning of them. Come write me down, ye powers above, the man that first created love. An English folk song begins. Robert Graves in The White Goddess talks about the Arabic poetic tradition of kindling, where an atmosphere is created in which poetry can happen. And obviously the 9 classical muses and the 3 original muses, but I won't be talking about those today. They merit a big section on themselves, on their own. Mentors and guides are another form of inspiration. Virgil to Dante, for example, that kind of thing. And Phil Terry, a colleague at Essex, when he wrote his version of Dante's Inferno, his mentor guide was Ted Berrigan, the American poet who was once taught at Essex. So he acted as Phil's guide. And there's that kind of humility and pride is embodied there, because if you've got a poetic mentor helping you, you're kind of apprenticing yourself to them, but also you're kind of cuddling up to the great and associating. So you've got that kind of balance of humility and pride there. Also, there are oracles one can visit, the original Greek oracles. The oracle at Delphi was essentially a drugged out priestess who was breathing in fumes and speaking kind of strange nonsense and brilliance. The second of 3 that I know about is Dordona, which is a grove of talking oaks and talking birds. And talking animals and birds are often figures of inspiration. A bird in a fairy tale will tell somebody an interesting truth. And Ted Hughes's poem, The Thought Fox, is a great example of that, of a kind of animal muse. The third Greek oracle is Trophonius, which is a kind of cave with a spring of remembering and forgetting. And there's a kind of death and rebirth thing going on there, really. So all of these things have their oracular elements. And it struck me when thinking about all this stuff that all form, all poetic form, all genres perhaps, everything like that acts in a kind of oracular way because it suggests, it gives something from the outside to the writer. And that ties in with the idea of Verlaine's idea of the donné, the kind of given bit of the piece you're creating, and then you have to kind of fill in the rest, really. I want to go on to talk a bit about towers, the tower as a symbol of inspiration, and then I'll talk a little tiny bit about windmills as well. Usually the idea of the tower is one immediately thinks of Babel in the Bible, which is a kind of symbol of human vanity. So they have that pride element in, but they also have the element of trying to get above things, get an overview of things, withdraw from things so you can see better. So, and probably the great writer about towers would be W.B. Yeats, whose 1928 collection, The Tower, and the title poem, begins actually with that ambiguity that I was talking about. He begins by talking about feeling incredibly old and described himself as being decrepit. And at the same time, he has a very excited imagination. He's never felt so inspired. So there's that, again, there's that ambiguity of kind of humility and pride that seems to be part of the process, really, of the creative process, I would say. So there's also a very simple visual aid here, which I'll just hold up. The lightning struck tower, the major arcana image from the tarot. And like many of the major arcana images, it's an ambiguous image because it's not necessarily negative. A bit like the hanged man is also the man suspended upside down so he can see things differently. And the lightning struck tower, it's only the crenellated, the kind of vein bit of the tower that's falling off. And the people are falling from the tower, but they don't look disturbed, and they're falling onto grass in the normal image of the lightning struck tower. So again, it's a kind of ambiguous image. And you also get that kind of the tower as the inverted underworld. So you get that kind of reversal thing going on there. The major arcana, the lightning struck tower, is between the card for the devil and the card for the star of hope. So there's also that ambiguity there, I'd suggest. So distance and exile and so on can be suggested by towers. Also getting above things, also seeing a bigger picture. And we think of something like Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower or Leonard Cohen's Tower of Song in connection with these. And we think of Rapunzel, Lady of Shalott, and that kind of thing. A tower, according to Chevalier's Dictionary of Symbols, is a symbol of exorbitance. But I would also say it's a symbol of exuberance, and obviously can be a lightning conductor. So you get this elemental element to inspiration. It always seems to be there, this movement, this pneuma thing. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about windmills as a positive image. And one of the things that the traditional English windmill can do is turn towards the wind. They're actually movable, and they can lift their arms. They can lift their arms to pray, like the tree in the corny old song, which I love so much. The tree that lifts her leafy arms to pray. Well, windmills can do that as well, and they have a lot of, they're connected with the ground. They grind something to make something positive. They're in tune with the wind and so on. And in a little village called appropriately High Easter in Essex, there's a wonderful converted windmill with a kind of glass top and a balcony on it. And when I drove there with a friend of mine who's interested in such symbolism, and he said he thought it looked like a magician's house, which I agree. So there are other great symbols which I haven't got time to talk about, like springs and rivers and trees that I've already mentioned. But I think the importance of the otherness in inspiration is really key. And I just like to quote D.H. Lawrence's poem, which begins, "Not I, but the wind that blows through me," which is from his love poem, "Look, We Have Come Through." So I would say you can actually define inspiration, but you'd probably best divine it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I always really enjoy hearing you talk. Okay, I'm going to keep going here, and we're going to move on to our fourth speaker, who is Dr. Peter Cheney. Peter Cheney is a professor in the Graduate School of Letters, Hiroshima University, life member at Clare Hall, the University of Cambridge, and visiting fellow in philosophy at the University of Durham. He's the author of Coleridge's Contemplative Philosophy, editor of Matter and Life in Coleridge, Schelling, and Other Dynamical Idealists, Imperfectionist Aesthetics in Art and Everyday Life, as well as Coleridge and Contemplation, and he is the co-editor of The Philosophy of Rhythm, Aesthetics, Poetics. His talk will be about transcendence from the British Romantics through contemporary writing. Please help me welcome Peter.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm just going to draw a quick line from the Romantics through Victorians to modernism, and emphasize a development, but also a continuity in seeing transcendence as a spur towards creativity, and also sort of maybe arguably or contentiously transcendence as a spur to make literature at its most pioneering, the literature which tries to articulate transcendence. Okay, I give graduate students quite often, when they're in the doldrums, which again is quite often, advice like take long walks by the river, go up mountains, keep a notebook everywhere, take more walks, jot down your ideas all the time, especially when it's quite adjacent, when it's not terribly related to your main topic. And I think this fits in with the theme that's been cropping up today, inspiration. And a student responded to me recently, because she'd just been going through a rather flat period, where she wasn't getting anything terribly inspired out. And she said that these techniques are interesting because they treat humanities research more like art or more like poetry than something academic. But well, exactly so. And it's the atelier or the artist's approach rather than the office workers or the laboratory workers approach, which is more academic, that I'm sort of stressing here. And this, of course, fits in with many of the Romantic dialectics, such as organicism and over-mechanism. Wordsworth claimed that 9/10 of my verses have been murmured out in the open air. He wrote in a sonnet, in a carriage upon the banks of the Rhine, where he describes a train journey where sadness steals o'er the defrauded heart while sweeping by, comparing that with the liberty of walking, where you're free to muse, to creep, to halt at will, to gaze. the journeying artist's approach to work versus the office worker academic model also accepts Coleridge's view that creativity requires contemplating universal powers, laws of tragedy, but also those of physics and of the cosmos. These Platonic ideas can't be generated at will like fictional inventions, but he says they are truths or powers to which we have to become attuned, if we are to become attuned. A pioneering literary writer is therefore an explorer and a discoverer, and not just an inventor of fictions. To attune to underlying dynamics, rather than be merely pulled in their sway, we have to direct our attention towards them and wait. Coleridge noted that the fewest among the few live in the light of these ideas or powers, and yet all live in their power, with the idea working in them. When he was explicating Wordsworth in the second volume of Biographia Literaria on the vision and the faculty divine, he quoted Plotinus, who said, "Wait, for it either appears to us or it does not, this inspiration, so that we ought not to pursue it with a view of detecting its secret source, but watch in quiet till it suddenly shines on us." Wordsworth too said, "We can feed this mind of ours in a wise passiveness." And Coleridge anticipated a future time when the dignity of passiveness to worthy action will make men as proud within themselves of having remained an hour in a state of deep, tranquil emotion, as they now are in having figured away an hour. For Wordsworth, that vision and faculty divine is among the highest gifts endowed to the many poets that are sown by nature, though most are left wanting the accomplishment of verse. Thus, all but a scattered few live out their time husbanding that which they possess and go to the grave unthought of. And there seems truth to this, encompassing uneducated sages such as Wordsworth's famous leech gatherer or his old man travelling, who does not move with pain but moves with thought. Yet such patient souls do not really go to the grave unthought of, or else they would not impress poets like Wordsworth, nor would they be recognized by the public as a type. General directed patience that moves with thought also expresses the vision and the faculty divine independently of the accomplishment of verse, and is part of what I have previously called the art of poetic life writing, which is an aesthetic or feeling-based commitment to realizing deep principles through the way one lives one's life. A sense of this creatively perceptive mode continued from Coleridge, with the idea that external ideas, external appearances symbolize cosmic principles. This might be understood as a kind of human projection, like in Coleridge's Dejection Ode, where in our life alone does nature live, or Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey sense of natural beauty being what we half create and what perceive. But they too, both of them also saw it as a kind of an aesthetic intimation of the inwardness of the cosmos, a special sort of transcendent intimation. Thomas Carlyle continued this with his view of the universe, when he said that the universe is but one vast symbol of God. Then in America, Ralph Waldo Emerson imported these ideas in founding American Transcendentalism. To create engaging new styles, to reframe every new era, to encapsulate current problems are among the vital ends of literature. But I propose that the most pioneering literary art attempts what most people consider to be impossible, that is, to articulate subtle or astounding impressions that most people consider to be ineffable, but feeling them as deeply significant. The ability not only to express, but make intelligible the emotions and inner purposes of dramatically opposed characters is one of the earliest feats of the literary arts. And people, including Socrates, at least according to Plato, saw this as a kind of divine inspiration. To go further and relate human drama to what Coleridge called eternal truths and divine ideas, or Emerson's sources of transcendence, is to express a seemingly mystical relation between the struggle of human lives and the powers of the cosmos. For John Keats, natural surroundings, walks in nature even, are the lodge of these solitary thinkings, such as dodge conception to the very bourne of heaven, then leave the naked brain. Carlyle, in his philosophical novel Sartor Resartus, argued that a deeply inward cosmic significance can add a mystical tint to ordinary perception. And this, he says, is evidence for his idea of natural supernaturalism, the view that nature is itself spiritual and full of meaningful interconnections. This deeply affected, moving into the Victorians, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who corresponded, in fact, with Carlyle and even wrote an essay on him. In her poem novel, Aurora Leigh, she held that natural things and spiritual things, who separates those two in art, morals, or the social drift, tears up the bonds of nature and brings death. Without the spiritual, observe, the natural is impossible. She then describes the natural and the supernatural experienced together in a sensitive attention to the world where earth's crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. Yet, we might add, the plucking and tasting of those juicy little fruits also expresses a wonderful, joyous communion. In the next century, Virginia Woolf in To the Lighthouse conveyed many and different epiphanies of life's purposes and of cosmic meaning within settings of nature's slow time, only seldom beheld in the breaks from human busying. She too was fascinated with Thomas Carlyle, whom her father knew well. Leslie Stephen saw Carlyle as his role model and set young Virginia several of his books to read. Woolf's mystical sense of underlying reality reached its artistic high point in her The Waves, where the appearances of nature and the inner monologues of 6 characters merge into one pulsing mystical whole. Woolfian reality is quantum, composed not of merely separate particles, but united as interconnecting, fast-spreading waves. And this is what she conveys in her memoir, A Sketch of the Past, posthumously published in Moments of Being, describing her mystical experiences when the normal ego loses boundaries and connects fully with the great surrounding reality. Around this time, her friend and correspondent Aldous Huxley, in his masterwork, I think, Eyeless in Gaza, portrays his protagonist transforming from cynical jazz-age socialite to a spiritual modern, awakened by mystical experience. And then Huxley's non-fictional The Perennial Philosophy commented on his millennia-spanning anthology of East and West mystical writings. T.S. Eliot fits in here, of course, too, describing the perpetual challenge of what I call the transcendence-facing literary writer as that of articulating the point of intersection of the timeless with time. And this attempt, he said, in Four Quartets, is a raid on the inarticulate, with shabby equipment always deteriorating, in the general mess of imprecision of feeling, where every attempt is a wholly new start and a different kind of failure. It's as if every new generation of poets and writers are rebuilding the ship of Theseus mid-voyage, plank by plank, saying again what has already been said, but it always needs to be re-said because it's never quite put perfectly. And in this, I think he re-articulates a more jubilant expression of this insight by Shelley, Percy Shelley. A great poem, he said, is a fountain forever, overflowing with the waters of wisdom and delight, and after one person and one age has exhausted all its divine effluence, with their peculiar relations, enable them to share another, and yet another succeeds, and new relations are ever developed, the source of an unforeseen and an unconceived delight. And I end there. Looping back to the Romantics. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was a really great talk. So many things to think about, and So many things said in such an interesting way. Let's move on to our next speaker, who is Kate Singer. Kate Singer is a professor at Mount Holyoke College, where she teaches on British and global romanticisms, affect theory, the Anthropocene, and post-human ecology in queer and non-binary 18th and 19th centuries. She's the author of Romantic Vacancy, The Poetics of Gender, Affect, and Radical Speculation, and is the co-editor of Material Transgressions, Beyond Romantic Bodies, Genders, Things. Kate has hinted to me that her talk may be more of an activity, but I don't have all the details, so we'll just have to see how it goes. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks for all of these wonderful talks. Can everybody hear me? Um, so I was a little ambitious at the end of the semester, but I try to suggest some maybe ways that these could offer some poetry prompts. I'm really thinking about two, I think, interlocking ideas. One is about occasional verse and how that might help us infiltrate our quotidian days with more poetry. And the other is I'm thinking of it being the inverse when we encounter poetry in public spaces and what those encounters might inspire us to do or think about. So I think I put some slides. There are just a few slides in the chat where they're they're just some poems that aren't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to view them, but you can if you'd like. So I was calling this occasional verse public poesis. The story about Anna Barbauld's The Mouse's Petition goes something like this. Wandering into Joseph Priestley's lab one day, Barbauld spotted the mouse behind bars of a cage for experimentation. Penning this poem, she eventually attaches it to the cage for Priestley to come upon when he next views the mouse for his nefarious scientific means. While we might now trace the poem's seriousness, or quasi-satirical seriousness through the frames of post-human inquiry and feminist science, what interests me as a writer is the event of composition, or perhaps the pre-event that instigated the urge. And we might think about the other talks about inspiration. Specificity of the affective and intellectual encounter as a mini event reverberates in another of Barbauld's poems, an inventory of the furniture in Dr. Priestley's study, which among other things traces the objects and spaces within his study. This list poem, not unlike Homer's description of Achilles' shield, traces a thing in the world to think through its phenomenological, if not its metaphysical status, to transform through poetic description and figurative comparison the seemingly quotidian into something more. Yet the specificity of the moment, the presence of an identified and particular speaker and addressee, could seem to bend the greater romantic lyric back to something less important, rather than the universal overhear or respondent, say of To Autumn, written to any Briton who has crunched through the last of the season's apples. These poems are at least first written for Priestley, with us as sly readers of someone else's letter strewn on the table. Or perhaps a better comparison is to be CC'd or be CC'd into an email, or the spectator in a group text whose subject has turned to an event we couldn't attend, or were in another part of the party when a joke was made. What I'm trying to do is to embrace the specificity of the speaker and addressee, of the moment, of the micro event, as a route not to an elite Shelleyan or academic audience, but as its own semi-private experience that can still be read as such, as a sliver of someone else's life that we might want to learn, even as something that is not absorbable or possessible as our own. I am interested in the precision of the encounter as well as the seeming spontaneity of the moment of composition, or at the very least of its inspiration, not unlike the apocryphal stories of Frank O'Hara running into another room at a party to pen a poem like Meditations in an Emergency. I am even more interested in how the poetic might become part of our lives in ways that blur the quotidian or pathetic and the hyperbolous or poetic. What might it mean to respond to a child's text with a short poem along the lines of William Carlos Williams's "This is just to say," for example, this is just to repeat, please remember your French horn when you leave for school. As our schools are in opposite directions, I have an 8 a.m. meeting with the provost. It is snowing and the plows have their own journey. My favorite text exchange with my son recently, in and among reminders and nagging, was a thread he started with a poem written using the AI suggestions for words at the bottom of his composition device, his iPad. Perhaps not like John Cage's I Ching poems, but here playing with the occasions of automaticity and the suggestions that computer made for logical connections that my 12-year-old enjoys to thwart. And I did a screenshot of like we kind of composed these automatic poems back and forth for maybe 2 or 3 times. These moments of occasion that slow down, but perhaps not pause, give us a lyricism not simply of time or pause moments, but moments of relational encounter with beings, but also with the event itself, with shapes of space, and especially the ways we understand the world through both empirical observation, imaginative play with that observation, and the encounter of both. Adam had asked us to think about potential writing prompts, and though occasional verse would seem to be prompted by random, affectively charged moments, I started to wonder how we might think of the moments of occasionality as prompted by topos of romantic activation. Not not Wordsworth's leech gatherer per se, but perhaps the intrusion of a memory of a child, of a loved one, or a loved one brought on by returning to the spot you once traveled to together, or by your iPhone deciding to recirculate a picture from that day, or by an iPhone deciding to prompt you which words to use in a kind of poetic repetition. Or maybe the reflection a moment later in the day of an argument with a teen child that you wish to repair along the lines of, I thought you said, what I meant to say, what I wish I had said. Or an encomium for a colleague or a student who said a remarkable thing in a meeting or class. Of course, celebrations are always occasions, but not just birthdays or holiday mornings, but occasions like half birthdays or dog adoption days or remembering to empty the dishwasher when asked. How occasionality interacts with retrospection, or I'm interested in how occasionality interacts with retrospection that is, as Locke says, revivified so as to be living again, to be remade again, to be an event again, speaks to me to the way psychologists think about our reprocessing experiences so they might be reset again as new occasions. These slow down our experience for sure, but they slow them down in the present, past, or future to adjust our own thinking and pace and quality of description to the beings taking part in it. And I will be very romantic to say that one of my favorite occasions is stumbling upon the poetic, however we want to define it, in public, surprisingly in public, I think. And thinking about the intersection or sometimes clash of aesthetics and the commercial, but even more poesis and the materials of the world, especially materials of the world that we think are only conduits for our moving from one place to another. So perhaps one encounter some of us have had is the Poetry in Motion project on the New York subway or Poems on the Underground, where you have poems or bits of poems that are put in the kind of placards or the ad space above your heads. Another example of this is on a recent trip to visit my brother in Los Angeles. I found excerpts of poems and other writing about the ocean on the Venice Pier. And if you look at the last slide, I put up a picture of what that looks like. So that you were reading words about the ocean as you were walking along the pier, looking out at the ocean. Though, of course, many of the oceans described in the clips were not the actual ocean that you were looking at. And maybe a final project I've been thinking about is Ada Limon's Poetry in Parks project, where poems are inscribed on picnic tables in US national parks. And there's another picture of that in the last slide. And so I'm interested to think about what occasions does it are we offered when we stumble upon poesis that brings poetic lines into and onto piers, tables, and subway cars? What would we want to inscribe for people traveling from one place to another, visiting a natural landmark, or spending leisure time with one another in public? What does it mean to write poetry for paper and to be printed, but also engraved or inscribed on some larger space in other kinds of material for readers who are moving through experiences of their own, or just simply moving from one place to another? Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I was just writing all that down because I feel like it's a great prompt. It basically is already in a prompt form, so I don't have to do any work now. So thank you so much. Let's go ahead and move on. We've got enough time left, I think, for our two other speakers here. And our next speaker is Andrew McInnes. Andrew McInnes is reader in Romanticisms and co-director of EHU 19, the 19th Century Research Center at Edge Hill University. He is widely published on Romanticism and its legacies and is co-author of Reading the Romantic Ridiculous. He is currently working on a critical edition of the Bronte sisters' first collaborative publication, Poems by Currer, Ellison, Acton Bell. His talk will deal with themes of ridiculous romantic verse, the Brontes, and misreading Keats. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you. I think I've remembered to unmute myself. Can you all hear me and see the PowerPoint? Thumbs up. I see some thumbs up. Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and keep to, like, I think 7 minutes. We sort of agreed, Adam. Here is my front cover slide of Swantje Gürtschel, who's a great German artist, throwing a yogurt pot in an Arctic lake, which is her kind of remediation of the Caspar David Friedrich Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog in some ways. And I used it because I like romantic updates. And I also think it's sort of funny, but also sort of making some sort of comment about climate crisis. She has some other great images, which I recommend you seek out. Anyway, so I think Adam asked me here to talk about ridiculousness. I'm going to start with a bit of that, thinking about Coleridge falling down Broad Stand. And I've been sort of making notes as we've been going through on people who said things that sort of segue interestingly into my stuff, or hopefully into my stuff, I suppose. So somebody talked about being on a precipice, like very early on in this session, and I just wrote down stumbling from Kate's talk and underlined it because I'm going to think about some sort of romantic falling as a way of thinking about romantic creativity. Then I'm going to sort of segue into like telling you about a thing that I did in the summer that I really enjoyed, which was about misreading Keats's great On a Grecian Urn thing. It's just an excuse to show you a bit of obscene art and show you the bit from a longer essay that I thought the editors were definitely going to make me cut. And then that's going to sort of bring us somehow into thinking about Emily Bronte and her fantastic poem, A Daydream, that I've recently been working on. And all of this has an image of the wanderer falling off the mountain, which takes us into Coleridge. So when I was writing what's now called Reading the Romantic Ridiculous with Rita Dashwood, my postdoctoral researcher, this anecdote from Coleridge's letters where he talks about his mountaineering exploits and when he gets sort of stuck midway down a mountain was a sort of indicative anecdote for me in thinking about shifting from the sublime to the ridiculous. So we've heard a lot of speakers talk about sort of transcendence as something that romantic poets were trying to sort of strive towards. And I also scribbled down from Adam's talk sensuous incarnation, and I'm sort of here thinking about the sort of flip side of sensuous incarnation, where sort of incarnation goes sort of awry and leads us away from the sublime and back into our bodies. So I'm just trying to make the faces smaller. Sorry, that was me. Ah, now I've lost my whole thing. That's bad. There we go. You can still all see that, right? I'm just assuming you can because it's got a green line over it. Anyway, here is Coleridge talking about the time he nearly fell down a mountain. He says, "My limbs were all in a tremble. I lay upon my back to rest myself and was beginning, according to my custom, to laugh at myself for a madman, when the sight of the crags above me on each side and the impetuous clouds just over them, posting so luridly and so rapidly northward, overawed me. I lay in a state of almost prophetic trance and delight, and blessed God aloud for the powers of reason of the will, which remaining no danger can overpower us." And I think there's a great toggling between sort of feeling ridiculous, laughing at himself for a madman, being trapped on this mountain with no way up and no way down, and a sort of shift towards transcendence where he sort of moves into prophetic trance, linking a bit to the sort of Adrian's talk on inspiration and oracularness. Delight, I think, is a key word for me. But there's this idea of sort of shifting towards the sublime from this feeling of ridiculousness and vulnerability. But I'm also interested in sort of what happens afterwards when he gets off his sort of shelf that he's stuck on and begins to sort of get down the rest of the mountain. So he says, "So I began to descend when I felt an odd sensation across my whole breast, not pain nor itching, and putting my hand on it, I found it all bumpy, and on looking saw the whole of my breast from my neck crossed out to my navel, and exactly all that my camel hair breast shield covers, filled with great red heat bumps, so thick that no hair could lie between them. They still remain, but are evidently less, and I have no doubt will wholly disappear in a few days. It was, however, a startling proof to me of the violent exertions which I had made." And there's a sort of toggling back to the ridiculous here, where I think he sort of moves back into that the sort of bodily effects of his climbing of the mountain. And what I was interested in writing about the ridiculousness in romantic writing, particularly with Coleridge, is this sort of movement between moments of sublimity, aiming towards transcendence and the like, and moments of sort of ridiculousness where he sort of becomes like almost painfully, embarrassingly aware of his own body and of his own failings, and how that might cause sort of laughter when he laughs at himself for a madman, but it sort of provides an alternative form of inspiration, which sort of reroutes us from transcendence back into the body. On Blue Sky, I described my talk as three ideas, three unrelated ideas in a trench coat, and so we're going to sort of shift gear rapidly to thinking about Keats's On a Grecian Urn. And essentially, I just wanted to share this bit of art with you because I was delighted that it got made. So I published a thing with Dilettante Army, who are a fab outfit that I highly recommend people seek out, not just for my thing. And this is a piece of art by, just let me flick through, Kenji Nakayama, which I thought was lovely, and is inspired by a question I asked myself when I was marking an essay that quoted from Poetry Foundation's study guide on Ode on a Grecian Urn, when they said, "Is the urn's attractiveness and round is the odes?" Well, there's my alarm. I've talked too much. Anyway, is the ode's slenderness and round opening attractive? And this is what I thought of that, and it led me to a longer piece that thought about poetic voice, desire, and romantic poets, and their interest in fucking objects, I suppose. So here's the bit that I thought they were going to make me cut, but they only complained about a line that I have in there, which is a version of a line from an Arab strap song. So the third stanza of Ode on a Grecian Urn constitutes a climax of a sort in my masturbatory reading of the ode. By the time we get to more happy love, more happy, happy love, Keats's ejaculations resemble exactly that. The last line of the stanza register the bodily effects of climax, all passion, all breathing passion far above that leave a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Pass Keats something to wipe with. Oren Wang reads this stanza in particular as Keats engaging with cliche, which we've also talked about this afternoon, connecting the term's sense of literary exhaustion with its original use as an onomatopoeic figure in printing. The thud, thud, thud of the printer's cliche becomes Keats's thudding use of language here, deliberately overwrought, as Narcissian would argue. Audible, unfortunately, in the thud, thud, thud of the printer's press is the thrusting of Keats's verse in masturbatory strokes, leading to, in Wang's words, not mine, an adolescent gush. And one of the things that I really enjoyed with writing this piece was the opportunity to be silly and ridiculous myself, but the opportunity also to think of criticism as an art, which Peter was just talking about, something that you can have fun with, something that you can structure as a sort of series of jokes, but which also has a sort of serious point in thinking about the representation of desire and how voice works in a lyric poem. So that brings me to my next sort of wild gear change, thinking about Emily Bronte's Daydream, and this is just a little snippet of a longer work where, and I chose two stanzas from in the poem, which are clearly sort of looking back at Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So Emily says that the trees did wave their plumy crests, the glad birds caroled clear, and I of all the wedding guests was only sullen there. And the wedding, as my students have pointed out to me, which I sort of misread at first, is a wedding of May into June. So it's a sort of celebration of sort of the movement of spring into summer, with the speaker of the poem feeling sort of sullen and left out, and sort of looking forward to winter where everything is dead, which like I often experience in the height of our increasingly sweaty summers. And then just to hammer home the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner connection, sort of moving from a seasonal wedding to a sort of a transcendent experience of the speaker's own, where she says, "A thousand gleaming fires seem kindly in the air. A thousand silvery lyres resounded far and near." And I think there's like an echo of the thousand slimy things that the ancient mariner witnesses in his poem, in this poem, where Bronte's speaker sort of hallucinates um, sort of fairy folk who tell her about life after death and reassure her that sort of winter is coming, and death is part of life, which sort of brings us into a new mode of being. So this is a whirlwind shoot through several different and distinct ideas. But I wanted to finish with a lovely statement by Janet Gazzari, a great critic of Emily Bronte's poetry, in particular from her book Last Things on Emily Bronte's poems, which sort of ties in with what a lot of speakers have been talking about in terms of joyfulness and delight. So she says about Bronte's work, supreme enjoyment and unqualified affirmation of the joy of being alive is the core of Bronte's poems and is entirely compatible with her intimate knowledge of despair and her unflinching recognition of our human capacity for cruelty and ingratitude. The poems share this ground with Wuthering Heights, which I think is a great turn in her thinking about joy, despair, and cruelty and ingratitude, to sort of link the poems to Wuthering Heights, but sort of perhaps gets us into or back to thinking about romantic creativity and its own investments in joyfulness amidst despair. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. Very interesting talk, and interesting to think about the ways that the three sort of people in a trench coat kind of make one body in the trench coat, that kind of thing. So I'm going to have fun trying to turn those into prompts as well. And now let's move along to our final speaker, who is Jim Ingle. who is sort of our last minute apparition here. And he's a former Gurney Research Professor of English and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books. I just picked a few out of the list, including The Call of Classical Literature in the Romantic Age, an edition of Wordsworth's Prelude, which seems relevant, Environment and Interdisciplinary Anthology, as well as The Creative Imagination. And Jim will close out our series, I assume, by saying something about creativity, a subject he has studied for many years. Thank you, Jim, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Time is short, so I'll try to be aphoristic. Aside from your introduction with the title of that book, The Creative Imagination, I'm not sure that the word imagination has been used yet in our roundtable, which probably would have shocked a lot of people 40 years ago. The recording may prove me wrong, but I do think it's important to remind ourselves that when we look, as Adam Walker looked for sources of romantic poetry, that the imagination certainly is one, and romantic poets and writers thought it was. But I want to emphasize that for them, it isn't just that they were exploring a faculty that already existed. They were actually creating that faculty. That is to say, the creative imagination is itself a product of human creativity. It is self-actuating. It is self-realizing. I think in its most radical form, this is what Blake had in mind about the imagination, that it is something that is, to a large degree, a product of what we call the Romantic movement. As we say, the Romantics are the classics of the modern world. And so there are so many connections with later 19th century, 20th and 21st century art. Now, when I wrote that book more than 40 years ago, I included quite a few figures in it, but there were many I did not include. And so if people have looked at that book, I'll mention just a few that I didn't really include much and that I think bear more examination. Not all of them are British. For example, Giambattista Vico, a great historian and student and studier of mythology. We haven't talked very much about mythology either. Hegel, certainly. And then other writers, British writers, Mary Shelley. Frankenstein certainly is a great modern myth. And one of the things that the Romantic movement tried to do was to create new myths. At the end of Schelling's career, he wrote The Gods of Samothrace, and Coleridge, writing about the Prometheus of Aeschylus, is also attention to the question of mythology. But Mary Shelley actually created a great modern myth, which lives continually with us. De Quincey, Joanna Baillie, I think often overlooked. Wordsworth admired her. She's a great artist in her own right. And of course, we've mentioned Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Edgar Allan Poe. There are just really so many writers in verse and in prose who have examined and extolled and created the idea of the imagination itself. Well, next I'd like to go back to Peter Cheney's handout. The handout that was posted on the chat was Peter's. It didn't have his name on it, but I want to make just a few quick comments about his points because I think they're salient. If you think of romantic creativity as an organic practice, this has enormous implications for criticism. If you think of the practice of creativity as organic, criticism has to be organic too, which means it has to toss out rules as such. It has to become more flexible. It has to fit its object. And this creativity is both active and passive. It is both. And in that sense, it engages the object and the subject both. In fact, it fuses the object and the subject. It turns an object into a subject and a subject into an object. That sounds perhaps a little confusing, but it is what Coleridge claimed, it's what Schelling claimed. It really is a philosophical move. The idea of trying to express the inevitable and to reach the sacred, it's really in part why we have symbols, that symbols do this in some sense, because symbols contain within themselves seeming opposites. They are what Robert Louth, in studying Hebrew poetry, which constantly reaches for transcendence, they are a mystical allegory, his highest level of allegory. I would also say that when we think about each age drawing new meaning from the same sources, paraphrase of Shelley, I think this would indicate to us that historicism in our study is both necessary and insufficient. It is both. That is, we have to take a historical view, but that is never sufficient for a comprehensive view of creativity and understanding it. The final thing I'd like to say very quickly is that art in this view of creativity is not just a supplement to philosophy, but in a sense the crown or the completion of philosophy. It brings back to the senses and to the palpable realization of our consciousness ideas and concepts which in philosophy do not have such a concrete embodiment. And in that sense, creativity completes philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Really great way to end our roundtable on romantic creativity, thinking about its relationship to criticism, its relationship to philosophy as the sort of like the the queen of knowledge or something like that, and how these things sort of have a priority or don't. I would like to say as well, just because I'm thinking about the time and everything, that we really have gone over the time here. And what I really hoped was that we would have a little time for all of you to talk to each other and kind of have a bit of back and forth. That would be a true roundtable. And I'm going to have to say, I don't think we're going to have time to do that. But perhaps we may be able to do something like this in the future, get everyone together and just sort of have a conversation. It would also be great to have questions from the audience. I suppose everyone probably has things that they need to go do. So if it's up to me, then let's thank our speakers for so many interesting talks, so many concepts and things to think about. And I think it would be great to try to circle back and maybe have a more open-ended conversation about things in the future. I would really like to do that. So on behalf of BARS as well, thank you to everyone that spoke today. Thank you for giving us a lot to think about. It seems like we're getting a lot of nice comments in the chat as well. So yeah, and thank you for the audience for coming along, giving us people to talk to. You have to have an audience, of course, to say what you want to say. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. If anybody else has anything they'd like to say, I'll open it up. And thank you again to everyone that came to this. I really appreciate it, and I think it was really great.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Is it worth mentioning again the session next week too?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.